Love classic cars, vintage machines, and the stories that drive them. Motorheritage.org.au is your hub for preserving Australia's rich motoring past.
I first met Mel Nichols in November 1970 on a bus. We were travelling from the Merimbula Airport to Twofold Bay for the launch of the Austin Tasman Kimberley. I was there for Australian Motorsports and Automobiles magazine, AMS. Mel, who'd only recently joined Wheels from the Sunday Mirror, struck up a conversation and we immediately became friends. A few weeks later, Mel rang to explain that Rob Luck was leaving Wheels and asked if I'd be interested in taking over as editor. Mel had turned down the job because he lacked motoring experience, having worked as a reporter on newspapers. First on the local Burnie Advocate in Tasmania, where he was a cadet. Then the Albury Border Mail, followed by the Daily Mirror. I did join Wheels and arrived in late February of '71. Mel and I worked closely together even after he'd taken over as editor of Sports Car World and until he departed for Europe in March 1973. And his objective was to fly into Rome, pick up a Fiat and drive to Palermo for what became the last World Championship sports car race on the Targa Florio course. By the end of 1974, Mel was the editor of the UK's car magazine and quickly became hugely influential. When he resigned in 1981, Car was the best motoring magazine in the world. My move to Wheels was the first of two profound impacts Mel was to have on my life and career. 18 years later, after stepping down as Wheels editor, Erica and I stayed with Mel and Wendy in London. Mel, by now a shiny bum and editorial director of Haymarket magazines, asked if I'd be interested in moving to Europe to work as European editor of Autocar, a new position. And it was one of the dozens of magazines he controlled editorially. We did, of course, went to Italy and stayed for 16 years. But these impacts work in both directions. On April the 27th, 1975, while in Barcelona for the Spanish Grand Prix, my first, I introduced Mel to Wendy, the woman who would eventually become his wife. Enough background. Mr. Nichols.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, you can guess where Wendy and I will be on 27th of April this year, Barcelona. Thank you, Peter. Okay, so I'm born in Hobart. I'm fourth generation Tasmanian on four sides. Families arrived from various parts of the UK, 1827 and 1832. That picture on the left was taken in Hobart when I was 4, I think. That's my grandfather's Homburg hat and his little carry bag because he was a physiotherapist who was very good at sports medicine. Anyway, and as you can see, that was my first car, a Cyclops Clipper, and I was very proud of that. The car behind me it's my first proper car. It's a 1953 Ford Prefect, bought the day after I turned 17. I got my license like most kids of my age, the day I turned 17. By then we were living up in Burnie on the northwest coast of Tassie, and I remember that car cost me £70, which was 7 weeks pay, as 10 weeks pay, started on £7 a week on the local newspaper. Anyway, that was my pride and joy, particularly because of the, excuse me, the chrome wheel trims and the red leather seats. But it served me well. Just after I moved to Albury when I was 19 to the bigger Border Morning Mail newspaper, I scurried off and bought from a government auction this Holden, also my pride of joy. Didn't really understand how poverty spec it was, but it was reliable and it took me to Melbourne many weekends and occasionally to Sydney. And when I came to Sydney, I worked first of all for the old Sydney Daily Mirror. You may remember was an afternoon tabloid newspaper. It's really the paper that made Rupert Murdoch's fortune and began his power, because it was a wreck sold to him as a loss maker, but very rapidly he bought a red hot editor, 35 years old, in from London, and a load of terrific sub-editors from newspapers he'd worked with in Fleet Street, and a load of hairy-ass kids like me in from the country who were well-trained young journalists. So there was all this energy and expertise, and it took the paper to 5 editions a day, excuse me, and absolutely wiped the floor with the rival Sun. So within 2 years, the Daily Mirror was the biggest selling newspaper in New South Wales, and thus Australia. So that gave him immense immediate power. From there he launched the Australian. Anyway, I lived in Glebe, in that house, and as soon as I could, when I was 20, I bought a British Racing Green MGA 1600 that was reliable. I didn't realise actually how kind it was to me, never, not tricky, didn't really oversteer, didn't understeer much, very good on long trips, and never got me into trouble, for which I am grateful. After I moved from the water.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. What an honour. Spencer Martin brings you a glass of water. I'll tell you about him later. He's responsible for me doing what I do, really. I moved to the Sunday Mirror. I moved to the Sunday Mirror, sorry chaps, and the news editor there knew that I was interested in cars and that I read motoring magazines, and he said, look, we'd like a motoring page, will you do it? Thank you God. So I started to write about cars, and of course I'd been reading motoring magazines all my life, so I had a reasonable amount of knowledge. But from then, after a while, I thought, you know what, my heart's in magazines. Didn't quite know why, but it was a strong feeling I had. So I heard the job was going as deputy editor on Wheels under Rob Luck, the editor, and moved there. Well, shortly after I got there, Rob Luck said, look, I'm off to Modern Motor, the absolute deadly rival. Will you come with me? And I thought, you know what, I'm a Wheels guy. I didn't really want to leave and go to Modern Motor. So I then had the task, knowing that although I was competent as a journalist, I didn't really have the depth of knowledge to edit such an authoritative magazine as Wheels. So I thought, who could I ask to edit this magazine? And I thought of Peter Robinson, who I knew certainly did have all that knowledge and all the integrity that being editor of Wheels required. So I rang Robbo and said, hey, would you like to come and be my boss? And how long and happy association then began. And this photograph is Peter and myself round the back of the old Pagewood? Pagewood Holden plant.
Do you recognise us?
Yes. That's got to be you on the left. You're on the far left, surely.
Well, I'm at the back door,
Yeah, it is.
and Mel's with the wheel stopwatches on the boot.
They're the famous Wheels road. That's the extent of the road test kit. 3 stopwatches in a wooden clipboard with a bar at the top to activate all 3 together. So the driver on a road test would obviously go off the line as fast as you could, and the passenger would be in charge of the stopwatches and click them all off as we passed various points, 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, etc., and right down, and we do several runs.
Yeah. The extraordinary thing about this is that this was the launch of the HQ Holden, the most important, newest Holden since the 48215. And we're at Pagewood. There was no meet the engineers, meet the designers, no talking to executives. You were simply given a car and you went away and did what you wanted with it. And because, well, I don't know quite why, but we ended up with a Belmont, 3 on the tree, 161 Belmont, which was not what we wanted. But it was a week, there were 2 weeks when we worked 107 and 108 hours consecutive weeks, because there was also a new Valiant, and they were desperately long weeks, because we wanted to drive everything and get stories into the magazine and so on. So the only way to do that was to work long hours.
Was that the test track, Peter? Is that where you did your times on that bit of road?
No.
We would have if hard pushed. Oh dear.
Sorry, Mel.
No worries. Okay, so the joyous days at Sports Car World opened up a broader sphere of motoring to me, and one of those was being able to drive unusual and fast cars. And I spotted this ESO in a showroom in William Street. I can't remember who the dealer was, but he had a lot of things like that. And asked if we could borrow it, so took it out to photograph and write a story. And oddly, it was one of the very few, I think there were only 7 automatic cars made, and this is the only automatic right-hand drive that somehow ended up in Sydney.
Is it a Griffo?
It's a Griffo, I'm sorry. It's a Griffo 7 litre. The dealer told me that it had the even more rare alloy block 7 litre. Didn't exist. Anyway, so that's the sort of thing that we tried to do, always get a good action picture as well as the static pretty pictures. And it was taken at McCar's Creek, was it? Up near Pittwater somewhere.
And the photographer was Uwe Kirstner, whom you will meet later on. John Mern, do you know if that car's still in Australia?
No, I think it's in the US. I inquired about it a few years ago.
Yeah, no, it lives in Adelaide.
Does it?
And it's been restored and very carefully kept.
Really?
Yes. I wrote a story about it a couple of years ago for the intercooler. I'll come back to that later, but I got onto the owner then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now this is another Uwe Kirstner photograph, and the subsequent one is also Uwe.
We couldn't wait to get our hands on the Phase 3 GTHO and managed to do that through the offices of Ford's wonderful Sydney PR man, Max Ward, and Howard Larson, who ran Ford's racing operation in Melbourne. Anyway, we arranged to get the car over a weekend. Uwe and I we'd had a Bolwell convertible in Sydney all through the week, and we jumped into that on a Friday, drove down to Melbourne, picked up the Phase 3 and stayed overnight in a hotel in Melbourne. Then early the next day we took off up to a road where Peter had very helpfully marked out, put marks on the road where you could run performance figures from his time when he was AMS in Melbourne. Yeah. And so we went out there, ran the performance figures, and we were on our way back into Broadmeadows to leave the car at the end of the day when we said, look, this car is so amazing, we can't just give this car back. Let's go to Albury. So we shot off to Albury, where of course I'd been on the local paper.
And Uwe had also worked there.
Yeah, different times he worked there. He had friends, not least a girlfriend in Albury. So we thought, let's scoot up to Albury. So we had a fast run through the rain and the dark, and we arrived at Albury about 9 o'clock at night, had dinner. The thing was, the car had to be back at Broadmeadows by 11 a.m. the next day. We stayed in bed too long, we got up too late, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and we thought, bloody hell, a bit of a challenge. So effectively we had 2 hours for 200 miles back to Broadmeadows. And if Peter clicks onto the next shot. So this is the picture that subsequently became the most famous picture in Australian motoring, so I understand. And that's the speedo off the clock and the the engine's bouncing off the road limiter. Uwe, always brave, climbed into the back seat and put his Nikon F1 over my shoulder. This is a considerable feat because you're in a car that's bouncing around a bit, trying to keep it still, get the exposure and focus correct. Anyway, he did it, and so the result is that picture. So this is northern Victoria on a Sunday morning, absolutely no traffic, and that car was absolutely flat out for some minutes. And so this is the story that became famous as Ho Down the Hume.
But before that story appeared in Sports Car World in 1974, Mel wrote an objective road test about the car, and we put the photographs into the system. And our executive editor, a bloke called Lyle Koosland, saw the photograph and looked at the Speedo and took it up to the managing director, and they came down and they said, you can't run it. We said, what do you mean we can't run it? You can't run a photograph with the Speedo above 140 miles an hour. And so there was a lot of argy-bargy, and eventually we agreed that they would move the Speedo needle back to 90-something, which would be the maximum speed in third gear. So we did that. We were very unhappy about it, but subsequently Lyle was fired, and we realised we then had open slather. So Mel at this time was living in England. He was editing Car, and I asked him if he would write the background story about this adventure, which he did, and it was that story, Ho Down the Hume, which everyone remembers.
I still get people run into me and they still mention that story every few months. It pops up somewhere in a Facebook group or whatever. It's extraordinary, really. So as Peter says, in '73, I took off to Europe, and that was, I had been thinking about going, but my timing to coincide with the Targa Florio was because I'd gotten talking by correspondence with Bob Wallace, whom you may remember was the subsequently famous Lamborghini test driver, guy from near Auckland. Anyway, Bob was passing through Sydney in early '73, and I had a drink with him. He said, look, you've got to come to Sicily this year. It's the last proper Targa Florio. So I shuffled my plans forward and arranged flights, and off we went. Peter said we picked up a Fiat Coupe in Rome. In fact, my mate Pete and I flew to Palermo in Sicily, and the local Fiat PR man had a 124 Sport Coupe waiting on the tarmac for us. And while everyone else trooped into the terminal, their bags went in. Our bags were removed, put into the boot of the Fiat, and Guy went across, opened the gate from the airport out onto the road and bid us farewell. So I think it's not possible to do something like that at airports these days. Anyway, so we were at that magical last Targa Florio, and I took that picture from the corner that had already become known as Nino's Corner, because that's where the local Sicilian driver, Nino Vaccarella, crashed. How many years before, Peter? Which year? 67?
Can't remember.
Yeah. Anyway, and after that year's crash, locals wrote on the wall over there somewhere on the way in, "Attento Nino, don't crash." Anyway, this corner in this picture has a role for us further on, because years later Peter went back and then we went back together. My time also in Sicily involved this car. This is a '73 Corvette, stripped of its emissions kit, that was imported to Europe by a very good writer called Pete Lyons, who was covering the European Grand Prix season for Autosport magazine, and he thought it'd be rather neat to import a vet and to wander around Europe race to race in the Corvette. And I happened to say to him in the bar, we were all staying in the same hotel, what's your Corvette like on these roads, Pete? He said, well, tossed me the keys and said, you take it around tomorrow. So I had a lovely lap in Pete's vet, took some pictures and wrote a story about that. Being at there were all sorts of wonderful interactions with the drivers and the teams, because everything was so casual in those days. There were no proper pits or garages. The teams just took hold of a space they could get or a little local garage, and you could wander in and talk to them. I remember being in the little service area that Ferrari had set up. Brian Redman was there lying back on the bonnet of a 246 Dino, and Jackie X came back and said, Jesus Christ, Brian, you should, I didn't thank you for all those trucks. Sorry, I'm cocking this up. There'd been an incident where Redman passed a truck, and the trucks then assumed no more, practice days, everyone's on the road together. They didn't close the circuit for practice. They, normal traffic for everything from donkeys and Piaggio scooters to trucks and anything fast, and all the race cars were scooting around the circuit. And quite often they'd encounter a truck or a bulldozer or whatever. Anyway, Redman encounters this truck, gets around it, and the truck then assumed no more race cars coming, little knowing that X was coming behind him in a similar Ferrari. So he wasn't happy that he felt Redman had left him at disadvantage. Anyway, that was the sort of thing that happened.
Now, I'm not going to go on to the next one because it's based in Modena or around Modena. But if I may, Mel, tell one story which you like to tell. Here you have to imagine, here are two young Aussie blokes who have never been outside Australia before. They have a Fiat Coupe. They have been told you must go to Florence. You absolutely have to go to Florence. This is the beginning of the Renaissance. This is what you've read about all your life. You have to go to Florence. Well, as they drove north, they got north of Rome, and they started to see no signs for Florence. There were lots of signs for somewhere else, but it wasn't until they got into the Apennine Mountains that one of them said to the other, and I don't know which it was, do you reckon this place, Firenze, might be Florence?
Oh dear, it was many years before I did get back to Florence. As we went past the last sign saying Firenze that way, I said to Pete, do you think that might actually be Florence, Pete? We had no idea, poor innocent boys. Anyway, Fiat had said, look, when you've had enough of that Fiat, bring it back to Turin and we'll give you something else. So we took it back, and they gave us a 124 Sports Spider, and then we went to Rome and introduced ourselves to Rome with that. That was rather special too.
So you're now up to?
Yeah, so after Rome, Pete and I went to Modena, and I started to do some real work there with Lamborghini, Ferrari, Maserati, etc. Anyway, I'd arranged to meet Bob Wallace, who was at that time developing the first Countach, and I agreed to do an initial trip with him, and he said, look, the car's not ready, sorry, come back next week. But he then said, I'm just getting it ready because I'm going to go up to Monaco for the Grand Prix weekend. And I said, well, look, I'm going to be in Monaco that weekend. If you're driving up, if you've got a passenger? He said, no. I said, well, can I drive back with you? So that picture is taken in Casino Square on the Monday after the 73 Monaco Grand Prix, just as Bob and I depart for a really rather rapid trip back to Modena. I think it's about 230 miles. there is Bob during that trip. We're doing 160 miles an hour there. The speedo's not working, but I got him to work out accurately what the gearing, the mph per thousand was with that gearing. And so anyway, it was 160 miles an hour. Most of the trip was at that kind of speed. As you can see from his demeanour, very relaxed, looking extraordinarily into the distance, reading everything impeccably carefully. I was made aware of just how much he saw when, at one point, south of Genoa, we came up behind a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, and as we passed, I said, "Oh, interesting, Bob. That's a Roma car." And he said, "Yeah, and the one in front's from Torino." He'd clocked the second one in front that I hadn't even seen, and he'd spotted it from way back. Not only there were two rollers, but which towns they were from. So that was really an introduction to driving with very experienced drivers who, like all good race drivers, are so aware of what's happening a long, long way ahead and everything around them. That's after a few days after the race in the Lamborghini factory, and Bob took great time and effort to look after visitors. So my first tour of Lamborghini was in the hands of Bob, who took me around and explained everything. Seriously good bloke, never said much. If anyone's seen the film Lamborghini, made a couple of years ago, he was badly wronged in that it's being presented as a bit uncouth and rude, and he would absolutely never have said the things that they said, and nor should he have been played by a Californian actor who could not do a Kiwi accent. So I was a bit aggrieved about that film. I met Bob early one morning. He usually started the day at 5 o'clock and would get annoyed if he was getting on the road after 6 o'clock. And there he is fueling the Countach. That is absolutely Countach number 1. It's the one that's now green in the Lamborghini Museum. He would usually start off, he'd whip down to Rome, and if he thought he had enough time, he'd then think, well, another hour on to Napoli, that'll be fine. So he'd do several hundred miles and then intend to be back at the factory by about 4 in the afternoon. And then he would go straight into the design engineer's office and go over with them any things he thought needed to change. So he was hugely influential in the creation of the cars that Lamborghinis became. Car magazine. This is the first story about a new car I wrote for Car not long after I arrived. And it's here really to connect two things. One is that Car magazine, which revolutionised car magazines around the world because it was so forthright and because it combined extremely good journalism and photography with good writing. And that's because it was created by Aussies. There's a guy called Doug Blaine who went to England in 1962 and happened to become deputy editor of Car when it launched. Really was the editor. Well, Doug was a good, straightforward Aussie journalist, apart from being a very good writer, and he really set the tone and style for Car, and that was to tell absolutely the truth about cars, and that was pretty unusual at the time in the UK, where we subsequently realised that most of the staff, large numbers of the staff on other magazines sort of saw themselves as an adjunct to the motor industry, and they didn't want to upset their pals in the industry, so they would pull their punches, and instead of coming to a conclusion or a verdict about a car at the end of the story, they would just let it trail off when they think, oh, written enough now. So stories would just stop, and Car was absolutely not like that. Stories were properly crafted and went out of their way, didn't go out of their way, but simply as a matter of course expressed a view that, of what the staff thought about the cars. So that heading tells a story, as you can see, blunt, direct, too little, too late, and cost too much. about that MGB V8, a car that there was great expectation about how good an MGB would be with a V8 engine in it. There are two stories that I'm probably best known for. One is Hoe Down the Hume, and this is a photograph from the other one, which was called Convoy. Corny heading, ripped off from the film, but it was three gold-painted Lamborghinis that I was involved in taking from Modena back to London for the 1976 London Motor Show. I was in the opposite car and I got a call about midday one day to say, look, from the UK Lamborghini importer, a bloke called Roger Phillips, he said, look, I'm just going down to Italy to bring 3 cars back. If you can get yourself to Heathrow, you're welcome to come with us. So you don't get that sort of offer every day. I shot home, grabbed my passport, a camera, some clothes, went to Heathrow sufficiently fast to get booked on the way, dumped the car in the nearest
What were you driving?
Alfa GTV, not mine. Anyway, off we went. We stayed at the cars, of course, were not ready, as they never are in those, or never were in those days at Italian car factories. So we stayed a couple of nights in the apartment of René Leimer, who had bought Lamborghini from Ferruccio Lamborghini, and had a nice time eating, drinking, and finally, on a Friday afternoon, the cars were ready, but not early enough to start. So we took off early the next morning. We stayed overnight in France and then got up early on the Sunday morning and started to weave our way up through France. That photograph is taken, can you see the speedo is just over 160 miles an hour. So that's the speed, that's a V8 Urraco with a V8 silhouette in front. That's as fast as those little 3 litres could go. The Countach in front, of course, was 20 miles an hour quicker. That's a Sunday morning on the main order route up to Paris through near Beaune. As you can see, no traffic. So we just sat on 160 miles an hour for many, many miles. And mostly during that trip we were not below 120 miles an hour. You could do that then. There was no speed limit, just as with the Hoe Down the Hume. It was the days before speed limits. And we began to see policemen, gendarmes with their blue suits and white leather boots, leggings, were lining up beside the road, and somewhere parked on the overhead bridges you'd see a blue Renault gendarme van and all these policemen standing there, and we realised that they were kind of celebrating the fact that 3 gold Lamborghinis are belting up through France at some speed. Not one of them ever attempted to stop us, and they must have been radioing ahead because in the service areas they'd come over to chat and go like this as we left. Doesn't happen these days.
Tune in next week to Curious Jag for part 2, with 3 more thrilling episodes diving deeper into Mel Nichols' incredible driving life.